Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today, looking at our first revenue workshop involving SaaS revenue and how RightRev can help you handle that scenario. Before we actually take a look at our use case that we're going to dive into today, just a little bit of housekeeping. Who is RightRev and who am I? So first, RightRev is a revenue point solution that can help handle your most complex revenue scenarios and ultimately create those revenue calculations and journal entries for you to post into the ERP, while also giving you the ability to do a lot of analytics and reporting within our tool as well. So we work with your upstream processes to take in that order and billing information and layer in revenue calculations. Now, as far as who I am, my name is Andrew Trumpeter. I'm a solutions consultant here at RightRev. Prior to my time here, I did spend about 10 years as a revenue accountant, actually working primarily in the SaaS industry. So today's use case really hits home with me. Jumping right in, what is that use case? So today we're going to take a look at our fictitious customer Innovate 360. They, again, are in the SaaS industry. They do monthly revenue recognition for an annual subscription. What that looks like is they charge customers $50 per month, but on an annual basis. So $600 per user that they're recognizing monthly. As a part of any of their deals, they're also including an implementation or onboarding service at $1,000 per sale. That revenue is going to be recognized over time as it is completed, so more of like a percentage of completion schedule. With that, let's take a look at what RightRev can do for this scenario. So I'm going to start us out in RightRev, and we're going to start by looking at our revenue rules and some of the configuration that takes place before we ever would receive an order or an invoice. So to start things, we're going to look at our revenue rules and specifically those two products that we're going to be dealing with today. So we've got our Innovate 360 Pro product. This is our SaaS solution. It is going to be triggered upon the booking of the deal. So it's not going to be waiting on billing. It's not event-based. Once that deal is triggered, once it's completed, RightRev will release the revenue, and in this case, we're using a prorated distribution method, meaning we are going to ratably recognize that revenue over the term start and end date that we receive. We then also have our implementation services, which again, in this case, are going to be event-based. That event for us in this scenario is going to be based on percentage of completion, and we're using a cumulative percentage so that each month we will always take in and adjust based on that current percent complete. So with that, let's see how RightRev can handle that SaaS scenario. So to start, we're going to look at two different revenue contracts today. This first contract is our initial point of sale contract. So before we look at the individual line items themselves, just a little bit more about what this revenue contract houses. We have our customer-specific information, so customer name, currency, our legal entity, as well as created period. And then we also have our revenue contract number. This is RightRev's unique identifier to allow us to always group whatever revenue contracts you need and have a unique number that we can always point back to so we don't have any sort of duplication. This will help you in reporting and actually analyzing revenue. On the right-hand side, we have our core revenue metrics that we're tracking on each and every one of these revenue contracts. The first is the total contract value. So in this case, we have the two line items making up $7,000 in total contract value. For RightRev purposes, the total sales price of all of those products that we ingest is the contract value that we would represent. We're then also pulling in the total amount that's billed on each of these line items and summarizing this for you here on the right as well. Now, just as we looked at in the configuration, billing isn't actually triggering or relating to revenue in any way other than giving us our contract position of whether we have deferred revenue or whether we're in an unbilled revenue situation with like a contract asset position. The next metric is really the core of what we're doing here, and that's our revenue recognized to date. With this being the initial point of sale, we haven't run any sort of recognition journal entries yet, so it's still showing us as $0 recognized. The next two items work hand in hand, and actually in relation to that revenue recognized as well, make up your total contract value. So revenue plan in RightRev terms is going to be revenue that has been triggered. So we have either partially completed or we have fully completed those performance obligations and released revenue to start recognizing. In this example, as we showed in the configuration, this Innovate 360 Pro product is set to be triggered on bookings, meaning this full $6,000 is releasing upon that booking date and recognizing over that ratable term. So that represents our revenue planned in this agreement. And then we have $1,000 in revenue unplanned. Revenue unplanned is the opposite. So we have some sort of event, some sort of activity that still needs to take place for us to release revenue and ultimately trigger that recognition. So revenue unplanned is similar to remaining performance obligations. We then contract FX if that was a scenario. In this case, we are dealing with a USD contract in a USD org, so no FX applicable. But then ultimately, we are tracking that contract liability and contract asset position. So since we have no revenue recognized, but $1,500 billed, we're sitting in a $1,500 contract liability position. Now, for the line items themselves, it's important to note that we have each and every one of these products in this scenario set up to those revenue rules that we highlighted initially, and that is all automated as a part of the RightRev process. So once we ingest those orders, we're going to assign that revenue treatment, in this case, based on the products themselves. We can also make that a little bit more scenario-based, but for today's example, to keep things a little bit more simple, we are doing a product-by-product recognition rule. Our first product, the Innovate 360 Pro, we can see we sold that product for $6,000 with a quantity of 10 users. So again, $500 per user. We have then recognized that revenue. If I scroll to the right here, we have it recognizing over a ratable term starting January 1st, 2025, recognizing out through December 31st, 2025. I can click on this line item and see a bit more detail here. Most notably, we have our billings. So every single line item, we're going to show how much has actually been billed per line item. In this case, we have one invoice, our first monthly invoice associated to that SaaS product. I can see if I scroll down here and to the right, some of the metrics associated there. So we have our quantity that we billed. So it was for the 10 users. We billed for $500, that sort of thing. I then can also click into our revenue schedules. So this is obviously very important as we get into those journal entries. We can see initially we're releasing the entirety of our $6,000 contract based on the booking. So what that looks like, if I expand this, is we get a full revenue schedule of all of the future periods that we will be recognizing revenue associated to this line item. We can also see we're layering in the invoice itself. So this is our January invoice showing that, again, we're tracking this as a deferred revenue item in a contract liability position. We then also support SSP and cost. In this example, those are not applicable, so I will move right past those. Same scenario here on our second line item. This is our implementation services. We can see from a revenue schedule standpoint, we have not released any revenue. We have only taken in the invoice. We can see that our metrics also update here on the right as I click between these items to show the specifics associated to each individual line item. So we can see on our services item, we've billed the full $1,000, but we're still waiting for some sort of event or activity to take place to release that revenue and start our recognition process. Now, if I was to look at some of our available reporting before we move into the next stage of this scenario, let's take a look at our revenue waterfall. So because we only have one line item that's actually been planned and had that revenue trigger, we only see one line item on our revenue waterfall. And we can see it's that Innovate 360 Pro product. We can see we're recognizing $500 a month over a 12-month period. None of that revenue has yet to be recognized, so it's all sitting in that planned state. We have three different ways we can view this information. We can view it by line item, by product, which in this case is the same thing, and then instead of by month, we can see it by fiscal year as well. And that's all available here just out of the box from the reporting on our revenue contract. Now, let's advance this scenario a little bit further. So this was our initial point of sale. Let's say come February 1st, the client wants to add 5 additional users. We also then have revenue that needed to have been recognized in January that should have run. We've also maybe recognized 50% of that services revenue. So if I take a look at our second example today, our second revenue contract, it is that same example, just progressed one more month into the future with that contract modification included. So the main thing to highlight here before we look at some of the changes is this third line item that we've added. So it's a new order. It has been grouped into this existing revenue contract because we're treating it truly as a contract amendment, as an addition of users. So it is its own line item. We can see we took on 5 additional users. The term that's been assigned to that has been co-termed. So if I scroll to the right here for our revenue term, we're now recognizing February 1st through December 31st, 2025, aligning that end date just as you would do in your ordering process, and ultimately updating all of your revenue associated to this change. As I mentioned, when we click into these individual items, we can always look at that revenue schedule. So I'm clicking into our implementation services item, and we can see that we have 2 events that we have processed. The first event was for 50% completion associated to the month of January. So if I scroll to the right here, we can see that we processed an event. The triggering period was January 2025. So when we look at our waterfall scheduled here shortly, we'll see that we recognize 50% of this line item in January, and we have since released the remaining 50%, saying that we are now 100% complete from an implementation standpoint, and we're releasing and recognizing that final 50% here in February. Our additional line item for the contract modification that added 5 users, we can see the same sort of information. This will look very similar to the original subscription item that we had on our first contract, where we did the booking release. We were not waiting on invoicing. We weren't waiting on any event. Once we took in that order, we released all of that revenue based on that revenue term that I showed previously. We've also done additional billing this month. So we did the first month of billing associated to this amendment, as well as month 2 and month 2 of our SaaS billing for the original contract item. Now let's see how that updates all of our revenue metrics. And then we'll take a look at our waterfall to kind of finalize things for today's example. So with the contract modification, we see that our contract value did increase. So it increased based on the total sales price of that amendment, so the $27.50. We now, in this example, also have revenue recognized. So we did the first month of recognition in January, and we've taken on additional billing, updating our billed amount. We also no longer have unplanned revenue. So as we looked at that services item, that implementation services, we actually had released the entirety of that $1,000. It no longer sits in the unplanned bucket. It's now sitting in planned as well as recognized revenue. And then ultimately, we are still sitting in a contract liability position. As I would expect, we probably sit the remainder of this subscription term because we have billed more than we have recognized, and that should continue if trends continued on the billing side. So to wrap things up, let's end on our revenue waterfall report. Within this report, again, we have 3 different views that we can utilize to see that revenue waterfall. In this case, all 3 of our line items in the contract have a revenue waterfall schedule associated. So we can see our first line item from the first example is still recognizing over that remaining 12 months, still $500 a month. In this case, we have that future planned revenue, and we're also breaking it out by revenue that we have recognized. So you can see we recognized $500 in January associated to that SaaS line item. We then also have the same information for that implementation services item. So we've recognized $500 in January associated to that first 50% complete. And then we have planned out that remaining 50% to recognize here in February based on the completion of the service. And then lastly, we have that amendment that came through where we added users. We can see that we have 11 months of recognition based on that addition. And that is to start here in February and again run through the end of December 2025. Now, the other views of that, in this case, we do have multiple products or multiple line items for the same product. So our second view is summarized by product. We can see all of that revenue recognition and see that starting in February, we're now recognizing $750 associated to that Innovate 360 Pro product. And then lastly, not a whole lot of change here on the fiscal year information, other than we have added the implementation services item, and we can see that Innovate 360 Pro added users. So this was a very basic, simple scenario. That being said, this is how RightRev would typically handle a SaaS solution and layer in things like contract amendments and implementation services, things like that. We also have the ability to handle more complexity there. So I mentioned SSP, if that came into play, if we were dealing with a multi-element arrangement, if the contract modification adjusted our allocations, that sort of thing, we obviously can handle those as well. But we wanted to keep it fairly simple today to highlight just a simple SaaS scenario. Now that this is all created, the next step of the process would be for us to create our journal entries, which we can do within the platform here, post those into your ERP, ultimately allowing you to then do reporting and analytics out of RightRev, and again, acting as your true revenue subledger for all revenue activity. Now, thank you for joining with me today and watching as we walked through our SaaS scenario for Innovate 360. I hope this was a valuable learning experience for everyone, and I invite you to continue to keep a lookout for future workshops as we will get into more and more scenarios, including things like hardware, usage and consumption, and some of those SSP scenarios that I talked about previously. So yeah, thank you for joining. I look forward to seeing you next time.